All right. So, okay. Did he ever tell you anything about like what his childhood was like? Anything? So, what was the town in Romania? Do you know?
Well, I know that my parents lived in Bucharest.
Uh-huh.
I was born in Galați, which is a community, just a different part of Romania. But after the war, they were relocated in Bucharest. Or actually, I shouldn't say after the war. That's where their factory was in Bucharest, and the Russian, when German lost Second World War and they retreated back to Germany, the Soviet Union pretty much took over the Eastern Bloc, including Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia,
Yeah.
Bulgaria, etc.
Yeah.
So my parents' factory and their house was pretty much now the whole country, Romania, was under Soviet control.
Yeah.
And the Romanian government, which was pretty much a puppet of the Russian government, of the Soviet Union, they all became heavy communists. And as communism go, private property now belongs to the state.
Right.
And
Right.
so that's really what I remember about Bucharest, is where the Russian Romanian authorities came to our house and confiscated basically the house.
Do you remember them actually coming?
I do. I remember they're coming in, and basically we had a fairly good sized house, big house. They restricted our movement to the kitchen, bathroom, one bedroom, and I remember them putting in a thread, allowing, say, you can only go to, the rest of the house is blocked, you're not allowed to go, and they put a thread.
Were there how would they enforce that?
Well, I don't know how they enforce it, but they probably can come in every day and check, make sure that we're restricted to only those rooms and
Yeah.
not go beyond it. And I remember, this is the one thing I remember from Romania, I don't know why it stayed with me, is they use like a candle wax to glue the thread that blocks our movement to the other part of the house, and they thread it basically in a hallway, saying you cannot go beyond that. You know, I remember after they left, my parents were devastated, but I could see in their eyes, could see their expression, and they were pretty sad. And, you know, when I was 4 years old, I started to laugh. I say, don't worry, see, I took the thread, pull it out, and say, now we can go there. Why do I remember this thing? I don't know.
Yeah.
But this is one of the things I remember from Romania. So that was Bucharest. So this is where sometime after that, my father told me that so this must have been 45, 46, no, must have been 47, because I was 3 or 4 years old, 47. This is where my father told me that after this event, they applied for a visa to go to Israel. And
well, and Israel being like after it was established as a state.
right, the state was established in 48.
Mm-hmm.
So this must have been 48 then.
Yeah.
Although in 47 too, there was a lot of Jews that immigrated to Israel.
Right.
So I'm not sure exactly when it was, even though could have been before 48, it could have been right on 48. But I know that the permission did not come till 1950. So the movement to leave Romania.
So they applied and then had to wait like a year or 2 years.
You wait years and years.
Yeah.
Right. So I think, I don't remember when they applied. I remember specifically, my father said after the incident where the house was basically taken over at the factory. Well, we were not able. My father was not able to even walk into the factory. He had to report to someone who now controls the factory.
So he wasn't allowed back in the factory?
No, he was right. It was taken. It would now belong to the Romanian government, and they assigned someone to control it. I think my father was asked to advise on some things, what to do in there, because he has knowledge of equipment, material, but he was not allowed to operate the factory anymore.
And was that the case for all Jews?
It was the case where private property does not belong anymore to private people, to people who owns factories, restaurants, any kind of business that was now run by the state. So there was a process where you report to the state, you get permission to do anything that you want to do. Before it was your own property and you do what you want. Now you had to get permission from the state to do any kind of changes in that. In my father's case, because the Romanian government, Romanian army needed clothes, they assigned their own people to run the factory and generate clothes for them.
I see.
Material, blankets,
I see.
towels,
I see.
whatever.
So they took it almost like a state operated resource for the
army. Yeah, and they had
army.
done that with many other factories to support the army, to support whatever the Romanian government needed. In some cases, they would allow some of the people to work. I know my father was telling me that he had friends that were more involved in their own businesses than he was, but for some reason they would not. They would only ask him periodically. So my father ended up working for some other factory as I think they called him a technician in textile. He was with his experience, he was pretty much a senior technician because he knew the operation of every phase of the factory, from putting machines together to incorporating the material, the threads that eventually become materials, where to put them. It's really without the technology we have in 2021, you're talking about 1940, 40 in the 40s.
Yeah.
A lot of it was labor intensive that you would engage, and
right, because you remember like helping out at the textile
oh my God,
factory.
I actually love that because it's the loom, the structure was huge. So I would, and you need to be a small person to get underneath and for each thread to take it further into the next slot where it goes, because the way the clothes are made, the way material textile, you have a let's say a machine that's the width of, let's say, 4 feet. So you have you have 4 feet of threads. So the threads, they are on a cylinder, fairly good sized cylinder, because that can amount to maybe 4 or 5 miles of the thread. So they have to be on a cylinder, and the cylinder is what that's from the cylinder you get the threads, and then the threads go into a comb, and each thread has to go into individual place in the comb, and the comb is about 4 feet. So the thread goes in. Now, so that is the vertical side of that, and then you have a machine that pushes another. It almost looks like a little bolt that has another thread in it that goes from one side to the other, and then the speed in which it goes makes engages the thread across. So the clothes are made with threads that go one side, and then the thread goes on the other side. one goes from right to left and one goes from that side to the other.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very, and if you have a thread that breaks, that tears,
Mm-hmm.
you end up with a material that has a defect in it.
Yeah.
So then you need to stop the
Oh
machine,
my God.
cut that part, and redo all the threads in the comb, and restart the machine. The clothes that you do generates lint, the kind of material that you need periodically to clean the machine.
Yeah.
So that's what I would do with a brush underneath the machine, clean all of the corners, make sure that all this lint and whatever else has been generated by the threads is now cleaned. So the machine is ready for the next cylinder of threads that you want, and that could be different colors, different material, different weight. The thread have different weight, so that's why you have textile that's heavier, some softer, some. There's variety of material, and that depends on the contract that my father would get from different manufacturers that want to purchase so much of this material, and the way the threads are arranged in the cylinder makes up the colors, and you can see how different colors. And it's so a typical small factory would have like maybe a dozen machines like that, a dozen units, looms like that. Bigger factories have 2, 3 times or 4. So imagine the work you have to do on each one.
Yeah.
To be able to sustain each product and avoid mistake, avoid errors, avoid issues.
Did Saba have a lot of people working under him?
He did have in the factory that he and his brother and his father worked, and they were, I believe, they may have been on the.
So that's Saba on the.
Yeah. So now.
Right. And Saba's brother on the left, and Saba's stepfather in the middle.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So, how old were Saba and Safta? Do you know when they had you?
Yes, they were. They were married in 1936 on November 8th, which was Crystal night.
They were married on that same night?
They were the same night in Romania. I mean, who would know in Romania what happens in Germany in 1936? Because it took years for Germany from 1936 to 1939 when they started the war in Poland.
Yeah.
But they were married in November 8, 1936, and I was born in July 2nd, 1944. Saba was, I don't know how old he was. I probably can calculate that. Saba passed away when he was 85. Safta passed away when she was 90. So Saba passed away in 1994.
94. So.
And Safta 2 years later.
So would that be 1911 that he would? Was that? That
could be. That could be.
You said 1994.
1984.
He died.
He died in 85. Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe that's 1909. Either way, I guess calculate it later.
Yeah. Yes.
So what else from back then do you remember? I mean, I recognize that's probably so early on that you probably don't remember many things other than like the big things, like that incident with everyone.
You mean in Romania? I
Yeah.
really have very little
Yeah.
recollection of that.
Do you remember like your bedroom at all?
I do not. I do not remember that, but I do remember is the event that in 1950 when we had to go when we left for Israel on a boat, on a big boat. We were restricted. Each family to 50 pounds. And, no, I should say, I'm sorry, 50 kilograms.
50 kilograms, yeah.
50 kilograms, which is, you know, when you think about all of the furnishing in a house,
that's crazy.
50 kilograms. I remember I remember my parents were devastated with that, and you know, they looked around, they have a household of things, and basically ended up with some clothes, some pillows. There's just not, you can take on a boat when you have a restriction of 50 kilograms
per family.
Yeah, and
do you remember?
that was the reality of
Man.
And it was, and I think my father looked forward to leaving this. You know, it was very painful. I remember for him and for my mother, you know, to leave with so little. But I think the hope was that they would do better in Israel.
And they were born in Bucharest, as far as
yes,
you know.
Yes.
And so just generations back of Jews living in Romania, basically.
They were close to their family. They spent a lot of time with their family. Both my father and my mother family were fairly quite large size families, and I remember, and my they're visited often, but it was mostly family. They were friends as well.
Did you ever find out how Sab and Savta met?
No, I've asked that. I don't know.
It's a mystery.
It's crazy. I don't know, and I don't know if anybody's left to ask that. So perhaps Shelley might know, and it's a very good question. And I will. And I'm Facebook friend with Modi, and I'll ask and see.
Yeah, you should ask. See
if Shelley has any recollection of that.
Yeah.
But she would be the only person I know that can answer that question.
So, what do you remember about Savta from back in Romania?
Large family. He has an older brother that I don't think if you have met his kids. His older brother is Levi Lazar. My mother's middle name was Lazar. Her older brother, Levi Lazar, was an extremely charming individual, very facial resemblance to Maurice Chevalier, the French actor in movies, was as charming and very articulate. And she also had a younger brother she had a sister, Anna. I can't remember the younger brother name. Emil was the name of the younger brother. Anna was her sister's name. And I know they visited often. They spent a lot of time together with them. Although as a child, I really don't remember. I remember these people in Israel when they came and have recollection about their visit in Romania.
So did everybody basically come to Israel from both of their families that was alive?
From my father's side, his older sister, also named Anna. Anna was very popular, just like Nelu. Every other second person was Nelu or Anna. So from my father's side, Anna um, came to Israel. Anna lost her husband, so she remarried. Anna had two kids. One is Eddie, and younger daughter is Nadia. And Nadia and I are Facebook friends, and she shared with me information periodically about Eddie, and apparently he divorced his wife and moved with the new wife to the West Bank, and I guess he's not doing so well health-wise. But that's from my father's side. So that sister Anna Sandberger was the last name with her second husband. They moved to Israel. My father has also one other brother that came to Israel also. He lives in Haifa. He was a little bit more detached from Anna and from my father. And my father, of course, has the younger sister is Shelley. And Shelley and Moti, I think you probably heard about them. You met?
Yeah, I stayed with them when I was in Israel in '99.
Exactly. Shelley and Moti, Shelley and Benjamin, and there they have three kids. Moti being the oldest, and Shimon second oldest, and Dorit, youngest daughter. They're practically they all moved into Israel. Anna, my mother's sister, and her husband also moved to Israel. They have two kids, one Hari and one Nelu. My mother's older brother, Levi Lazar, and also two boys, one named Dutsu and one named Nelu. So Dutsu came to Joshua's bar mitzvah, and I don't know if you met him. Did you?
I remember that he smoked cigarettes.
He smoked cigarette and drank. Drank a lot. That was one thing with that family, with Levi Lazar's family. They were big drinkers. They were very sociable people. As I mentioned, Levi Lazar was very charming. His wife Bianca was also very lovely woman. They socialized a lot. They drank a lot. Unfortunately, one of their kids paid a high price for that. Nelu had serious liver problems because of alcohol, and he passed away quite a while ago. From Israel.
Well, before we get to Israel,
Yeah.
I'm wondering. I know there's one more big family story, which is the tragedy with your uncle, Saba's brother.
Yeah.
From could you share that?
Sure. That was that was in Galatz. And in Galatz, no, I'm sorry, that was in Iași. That's another community in Romania, Iași.
Do you remember the year?
No, I don't remember the year because obviously it was before my time.
But it was like sometime during the war.
It would have been obviously during the war, when prior to 1944. So it may have been 42, 41, 43, where the Germans were basically in control of Romania, control of Iași, and part of their master plan was the elimination of Jews. And so on that specific day, they the radio on the any communication newspapers requires that all Jewish men be in this central park by noon. there was unbeknown to them, they thought that it was part of some kind of effort to register people for the German to find out more who was there, who was not. So it wasn't, no one suspected the horrible events that were followed. People thought they were part of this reorganization that the Germans, Romanian German, sought to do at that time. And sure enough, at noon, from what I gathered, that their machine gun showed up on top of the building and just shooting, just plain shooting. My father remembers that his older, and he told me that his older brother had him lie down and he lied on top of him to, I don't know, if they would protect him or basically there wasn't room.
The brother lied on top of Saba.
Yeah. And with the machine guns, they got my uncle. My father was spared, perhaps because his brother protected him. And my father's, remember, he stayed there as long as there was sun because he didn't want to leave the area. And once once it got dark, whoever was still alive was escaping. And I don't know how he communicated with my mother where he was, or he was afraid to go back to the house because every home German knew where Jews lived. So it became obvious that they're trying to kill the Jews. So it was my father was in hiding for a while. Eventually he was able to communicate with my mother, and
so he didn't go back home after that?
Not right away, because he was afraid that from what he told me is that they may go after. They try to find out where if anybody alive, if they're still. So after a few days, I think they made contact. My father made contact with my mother, and I think things have either settled down a little bit, or that effort, German now had their energy elsewhere, and it wasn't as urgent to kill as many Jews in Yash, so he was able to go back home. But obviously, looking back at the years, they moved from Yash to Bucharest because they ended up in Romania, in Bucharest, before they left for Israel. So this must have been early 40s, 41, maybe 42, when the pogrom in Yash took place. Yeah.
That is crazy.
Yeah. I think when Mom and I were in D.C., Holocaust Museum, were able to go to the third floor where we saw some of the pictures, and that was the first time I saw actually the Yash streets and all the bodies that were there. It was pretty difficult to watch.
They had that was all documented at the Holocaust Museum?
Yeah, there's a whole, they've done an incredible job at documenting a lot of places where such pogroms took place. One of them was the Yash pogrom.
And before we move completely on from Romania, did anybody have pets?
Good question. I don't recall in Romania. In Israel, in one of, for some I have a recollection that I really wanted a pet, but it was very impractical where we lived. So I know my parents brought in a little puppy, a little dog. I cannot remember what I named that puppy. But after about 2 or 3 days, my father had to take it back to where we got it because it was just not practical.
Yeah.
I don't know the circumstances, what it was, but it was very short duration of having a pet.
So do you remember the boat? Do you remember being on it at all?
Not really. I have recollection of the leaving the boat in Israel in September 1950.
Where did it dock? Do you remember?
In Haifa.
Okay.
Yeah, we're in Haifa, and I remember we were met by army trucks that took us to old. No, first few days we were in tents. The army just put up tents.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, was the time where hundreds of thousands of Jews were eager, or I should say, they were always eager to leave Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. The Soviet Union, they were all under Soviet Union control, and they back in 1950, the Prime Minister of Israel was Ben-Gurion, which was a socialist leader. The party in control was Labor, or what they used to be called Mapai, in Israel at that time. And Mapai was a socialist, leftist party, and had the majority in the Knesset in Israel. They had more than 61 members, and they were pretty much they were very effective in this challenge of accommodating hundreds of thousands of Jews that were immigrating. Russia basically, or Soviet Union, assumed that Ben-Gurion, Socialist Party, is going to end up being part of the Soviet bloc, supporting them in the United Nations and following a more socialist directions. They discovered within 6 months that that's not going to happen. But there was a time, but when they thought that Ben-Gurion is going to be aligned with the Soviet Union, they opened the gate. They allowed Jews to leave Russia, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, etc., to move to Israel. So that's where hundreds of thousands of Jews came on boats on a daily basis. The army basically had to do all of those accommodations to prepare housing for these people. Tents were initially for the first few days. They cleaned up, they prepared some old British barracks that were still there because the British left Israel in 1948 when they declared independence. And so the barracks were still there, they weren't totally dismantled. So the army used them to accommodate. We lived in tents for the first few days, and then subsequently, I remember the old barracks, which were basically 200, 300, 400 feet long each one, circular, fairly wide, maybe 40, 50 feet apart wide. But between each family was given some space, but there were blankets for privacy. Mm-hmm. So that's really, which almost a joke in terms of privacy.
Yeah.
But there was really very little they could do. And then there were businesses that came in and interviewed people, wanted to know if you have any specialty. Do you are a barber? Do you have done any brickwork in construction, whatever, and then textile. So my father, obviously with this senior technology knowledge or senior tech this knowledge he has in textile, took as such a position. And so this company took him from the from the from the housing that we had on a daily basis. The factory come back, so he was able to earn quite well. And within, I believe, maybe 2 years or so, living in the army barracks, were able to purchase an apartment.
So you guys lived there for the first 2 years or so?
Yeah, we were in the barracks. School was more of it was a Montessori type concept where you have 3, 4, 5 grade levels in one classroom.
What about the language? Like you guys spoke Romanian?
Hebrew, or the teacher, and this was the part of the melting.
Yeah,
Yeah, where you speak different languages, but in school Hebrew.
Do you remember having any friends who spoke different languages as their first language?
Oh yeah, Bulgarian. For the most part, we were next to a group of people that came from Bulgaria. So
now you're like 5, 6 years old or so.
Yeah.
When you were in the tents, your next door neighbor was a Bulgarian family?
Yeah, we were living next to Bulgarian people, and we're not able to communicate because Romanian, Bulgarian, different languages. But the school is where we got the common language of Hebrew, and that's where we could then communicate as little as we could but this is where it all started. My parents, on the other hand, did not have that classroom, that Hebrew classroom, so they were pretty much limited to Yiddish and Romanian. And then even after we left the army barracks,
and they spoke Yiddish fluently?
Yeah, my parents both spoke fluent Yiddish.
So they were bilingual, Yiddish and Romanian.
Yiddish was a byproduct of being Jewish.
Yeah.
When you were a Jew in Eastern Europe, Yiddish was very much spoken. It's almost like a Jewish. This is what bridges Jews together when they were in the in Romania or Russia.
Yeah.
So my parents felt very comfortable speaking and engaging with other Romanian. So even when they left the barracks and moved to apartment, we would still, their knowledge of Hebrew would be minimal because there was no incentive for them. They had their neighbors that would speak in Yiddish.
I see.
Yeah, so they were pretty much, and then family came in, they would speak Romanian. So there was little for my father or mother to engage in Hebrew. My father had some more pretty minimal amount of Hebrew that he had to communicate with people at work, but not something beyond the elementary level of Hebrew.
And so he would go to work, they'd basically pick him up and take him.
Yeah, and that was from the we lived in a place called it's called Bar-Lev. Bar-Lev is it's actually, when you think about it, it's like a transit. It's not like a transit. So that's what these were called, Bar-Lev.
It was like transitional housing.
Like a transitional, right, whether it's a tent or army barracks. It was very, and from there, the people that wanted to work, employer will come pick them up and bring them back.
I see. And
because there's no other way for them to get to their employment. Savta was not able, she stayed at home.
Yeah.
She, do some cleaning in the area, she'd prepare food.
So was it like in the show MASH? Like those tents in that show?
Yeah, very similar. Very similar. That's exactly what it looked like.
Okay.
Exactly what it looked like.
And that first school that you went to when you guys for those first 2 years, and do you remember any of the other kids?
No, 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 not really. I have no recollection of that
Yeah.
other than that this is where we communicate in Hebrew. I don't remember any names or specific kids, but this is where I got my foundation of Hebrew. We're there for a couple of years, and then once we moved to this place called Neve Mishkan, which is the first place before. Neve Mishkan is where my parents and I lived until I finished high school, went to the army, came back from the army, and came to the United States. So all of this time, they lived in Neve Mishkan. When I left Israel, when I left Israel to Iowa, to the University of Northern Iowa, my parents were thinking about moving to Holon. And so they did a transit after I left Israel. So while I was in Israel, they were still living in Neve Mishkan.
I see.
And Neve Mishkan was a community that houses, I would say, probably about maybe 30, 40 apartment buildings. There were no businesses there or anything. It was just housing for people that worked in neighboring areas where there were employment sites. There is Neve Mishkan was very close to another community called Sahala, which was the community that housed many military officers, including the defense minister Moshe Dayan. Used to be also, before he became the defense minister, he was a commander general. So he grew up in the army. His son, he has a son named Asaf that he and I we're not very close, but we knew each other, acquaintances, played soccer together. He's a nice kid that ended up being an actor in Israeli television over the years. And he and Moshe Dayan also had a daughter, Yael, I believe. She also became a singer or actress. Asaf was a nice guy. I liked him, but I mean, we also I had another friend from Sahala. His name was Zevi. Zehev, which in Hebrew stands for wolf. Zev, we call him Zevi. We grew up, I mean, we were in going to school in a community called Tel Baruch. Tel Baruch is, so you have three communities, Neve Mishkan, Sahala, and Tel Baruch.
Okay.
Tel Baruch was the place where kids from Neve Mishkan or Sahala would go to school. So that was the Tel Baruch Elementary School. And this is the Tel Baruch school that on the way there we would hitchhike. And that's where I lost my violin intentionally.
You guys would hitchhike to school? Like, how long would it take if you would have just walked?
Oh, it would be probably about maybe 2 or 3 miles, so it wouldn't be too bad.
So, but closer, a long time.
But it was in Israel. You have to understand the concept. Hitchhiking in Israel, very common. It's almost like people feel that they are in the same. It's almost like a big family, big community. Soldiers that leave their army post, let's say have a 24, 48-hour break, hitchhike. And very common, and people pick each other, and it's culturally it was a very acceptable. Kids would hitchhike to school. There are no school buses. Kids would hitchhike to school, and on the way back home. A very common practice.
put your thumb out to hitchhike?
I'm sorry?
Would you put your thumb out to hitchhike? Just
yeah.
like
I mean, you would wave and you'd
Yeah.
wave and people would stop. And I've never had any problem. We've done it for years and years. So anyway, Zevi was in my class in Tel Baruch. So was Asi. Um, and we got to know each other. And then when we finished the elementary, middle school are the same in Tel Baruch, and we ended up. Some of us applied to different high school. We also take tests, and it was very common. There were basically three directions you could go. You can either go to a high school, you can go to a high school that prepares you to enter the workforce, industrial, or a high school that prepares you for agriculture work. So and there were Israel adopted the German concept of youth apprenticeship. The value in the youth apprenticeship is that kids that really don't want to go to spend years in high school preparing for university, instead prepare them to join the workforce. So they do a lot of that's smart.
So they would make choices with their family about what the kids
Already
which school.
at the end of middle school.
Like when they're like 13, 14.
Exactly. So and it also depended on a number of tests that you would take. That will help you make this decision.
I see.
So I did my test and I was accepted. Went to Gymnasia Herzliya, which in Tel Aviv is, that I'm not sure where it is today in light of all the high schools that have emerged since that time. But in the end of 1950, I must have joined high school in 58 because I graduated in 1962. That's when I went to the army in 62. But in 1958, when I went to Gymnasia Herzliya, Gymnasia Herzliya was probably the most prestigious high school in Tel Aviv. In fact, it was the first high school in Tel Aviv. It had beautiful facility, very historically.
So Saba and Savta must have been pretty proud of you getting into that school.
Yeah, I don't think they really understood.
Okay.
I mean, for them, you have to be aware of the Israeli culture but they knew I went to a good high school.
So you feel like they weren't really aware of Israeli
I think
culture?
they were proud of me. I mean, I've never felt that there wasn't any.
But they weren't like tapped into sort of like.
Yeah, I think they would probably have the same reaction if I were to be accepted to any high school that would prepare you for higher education.
I see.
There was some. Gymnasia was more of a unique in Tel Aviv's culture at that time.
I see.
It was a historical marker in Israel history.
Did Saba ever think that you were going to go into textiles?
He never made reference to that, and I think by his reaction to that wanted me to go to high school that will prepare me for university, I think he was basically saying, please do better than that kind of work, because it's hard work.
Do you remember what you wanted to, like, did you have an image of yourself as a grown-up when you were like 13, 14, like what job you thought you'd have?
I was still looking for that. I knew I wanted to study. I knew I wanted to study. I was thinking about law being one option. And I also was looking for very early, young age at speech pathology and audiology. For the most part, it's almost like, but I didn't know where to go with that. I did not know where to go with that. I just, when I was very young and very early years in the elementary schools, I was a severe stutterer. I remember like today, it's one situation where a good friend of mine, forget his name at that time, but I remember him being a good friend. So he happens to be asked by the teacher, so you can now assign who do you want to read the next paragraph in the chapter. So he immediately called on me, and I had a hard time reading that in the classroom because stutterer have a hard time with reading, especially when you have so many people around you.
Yeah.
So I didn't know, I knew I was interested in that, but I wasn't quite sure where to go with that. So when I was in Tel Aviv one time, I remember walking in the street and seeing a sign of a service provided for people who are deaf. And I wanted to know a bit more about that. So I went in, I talked to one of the manager, who happens to be an American native, who opened this facility for students, for children, family who have children who are hard of hearing. So I asked him about that, and he was telling me about the institution in universities in the United States that trained people, and he said with the same department also trained people to be speech pathologists and audiologists that can work with deaf and hard of hearing people, as well as people who have language difficulty, stuttering, and at that time like a bulb turned on in my head. And I started to look more into those areas, and that was pretty much, I think it was high school years when I was in Gymnasia Arcelia, and that's where I started to look at different courses that would allow that. And then obviously once when I went to my military service, which we can talk about it at some point, but afterward I applied. It so happened that Benjamin and Shelley, my relatives, had visitors from the United States, and Benjamin had a sister by the name of Lucia, and Lucia was married to a rabbi, Matzner, and they lived in Waterloo, Iowa. So they came to visit one time, Benjamin and Shelley, and we talked, and I remember that Lucia asked me what my interests are, and I said, interested. She said, there's a university not far from us that has a lot of departments. That's something that you can look at. Do they have it? So they went back. She contacted the university and sent me information in the mail that they do have a department for speech pathology and audiology that prepares you to be both. So when I came back from the Army, I decided to apply to them, but being such a far-fetched idea, kid from Neve Mishkan will end up University of Northern Iowa, I didn't have much hope for that. So I applied to there, but also applied to university, to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in the law school, which I was accepted, and I started the first semester until I got the notification from Iowa that I was accepted there. So,
wow. Let's take a 5-minute break, and and come back for
Okay.
a little more.
Okay, sounds good. 4 to 5.